All right, everybody, welcome. Thanks for sticking around with us the whole day, the entire day already, the late evening if you're joining us from Western Europe or anywhere else in the world. Without further ado, I would like to introduce to you Jack Madden as our final keynote speaker, and Jack is going to talk about the future of VDI in a world of workspaces. Now, Jack's not just any guy talking about VDI. He has got 8 years of experience writing not just about enterprise mobility, but also about end-user computing. And we just discussed he has written more than 1,000 articles in that time. Not only that, he's also a master of music. So here we go. Kick it off, Jack. The floor is yours.
Oh, well, thank you very much for that introduction, Mark. And yes, you've spoiled a little bit of my own introduction. So I'm Jack Madden. I live here in San Francisco, and I'm broadcasting live today from the Tech Target San Francisco office. A little bit about me, as Mark mentioned, in my spare time, I like to play trombone. In fact, I study trombone, and I'm here in this picture. I'm all the way in the back. There you go. Now you can see me. And it's okay to be in the back because the trombones, they play the loudest. Now I'm the executive editor of brianmadden.com. That's, of course, brianmadden.com, the website, which now we have to notice and separate that is separate from Brian Madden.com, or Brian Madden, the person who now works at VMware. So those are two different things, but Brian Madden, the website, is still independent, still a part of TechTarget, and I write there along with my colleague Kyle Johnson and our wonderful freelance contributors. I'll give this one quick second to give a plug to give me a follow on Twitter. It's very easy to find me. I'm just at Jack Madden. And any questions about today or anything that that you want to see my work, it's Twitter is the easiest place to get started. So I've been doing this end user computing stuff for 8 years now. For a little bit of proof, this is a much younger me at my very first week on the job at VMworld 2011 in Las Vegas. This is actually a video, and in the video where it's freeze framed, I was just almost run over by this electric motorized cart. So conferences, they have their dangerous points. So for these 8 years, I started out in the very beginning covering, indeed, enterprise mobility. I think it was a thing at the time. I was working with Brian and Gabe, and we started getting all of these pitches about what to do about those pesky BYOD iPads. Remember, this was 2011. Everybody was thinking, okay, this is the best thing since sliced bread. And I, as the junior writer of the three of us, was assigned, hey, go figure out what's going on in that enterprise mobility space. And of course, it being that early, and MDM and mobile app management were just a thing, and since not many people knew what was going on, there was a good opportunity for me to spend 40 hours a week, my entire job, figuring out what was going on. So I did that, and in 2013, I wrote this book, Enterprise Mobility Management, Everything You Need to Know About Mobile Device Management, Mobile App Management, and Bring Your Own Device. So me personally, mobility has been a strong part of what I do, and now these days I'm spending a lot of time on identity management and security as well. But of course, I write for brianmadden.com, and brianmadden.com has been blogging about desktop virtualization for 16 years now. And after all, my name is on the cover of a book called The VDI Delusion, Why Desktop Virtualization Failed to Live Up the Hype and What the Future Enterprise Desktop Will Really Look Like. And that book was written in 2012, and I think it gives us a lot of lessons that are still relevant today in 2019 as we look at the future of VDI. Of course, a year later, after a lot of very important developments in the industry happened, the three of us wrote The New VDI Reality, How the Biggest Barriers to VDI Adoption Have Finally Been Solved, and What This Means for the Future of the Enterprise Desktop. These two books really set up today's conversation in a good way. But so I'm really excited to be here talking about this particular topic because, after all, it is my job to cover not just desktop virtualization in VDI, but also mobility and endpoint management and identity management. And along with that, BYOD and all the crazy stuff that users do and whatever else comes next, like IoT and augmented reality, voice computing is something that we've been keeping an eye on because, frankly, we want to know which one of these new trends is going to come in and be the new moment of equivalent of when all those BYOD iPads and iPhones came in 10 years ago. So my mission is to look across all of these topics and understand them on a deep technical level, so that when some new product comes out or some new industry trend comes along, we can say not just, oh, this new industry trend is interesting, but we can say, okay, here are the technical ramifications of how it fits in and what it actually can and can't do. So it's a pretty fun job, and I'm excited to be here to be giving this talk, which is, of course, the future of VDI in a world of workspaces. So as we look towards the future, we're going to be taking two main things for granted. Overall, as we know, we can consider the past, and for much of the last decade, we've considered that, relatively speaking, VDI, it was complex, it was expensive, it was not an easy undertaking. Going in the future, we're taking for granted that VDI is becoming cheaper and easier. And we can argue all the specifics, and we'll do some of that later. And really, if you're watching this webinar, you probably spend a lot of your career arguing all the specifics, but just take it at a very fundamental level that as we go forward, VDI is becoming cheaper and easier. So I'm taking that for granted. But so why is VDI get better? Of course, we have a lot of investment continuing to come from, of course, Citrix, VMware, Microsoft with Windows Virtual Desktop, Amazon, Nutanix having just bought Frame, all of the wonderful partners, including many of them that are sponsoring and part of this webinar, and of course, Login VSI for hosting. All of this work is paying off with VDI indeed getting easier. And of course, we have the overall cloud trend to thank for it as well. We have infrastructure as a service for workloads. We have SaaS management planes. We have probably what we can consider platform as a service for all of the in-between stuff. And the cumulative effect of all this is, again, cheaper, easier. It's a central assumption that I'm making for the future. Finally, I'll also note that a lot of this is happening thanks to the work of VDI pros around the world. I mean, I've been part of this community for longer than I've been writing at TechTarget, and I've seen a lot of different areas of the IT world, and I have to say that out of all parts of end user computing, the VDI and desktop virtualization space is one of the strongest and greatest communities that I've seen. So I'm privileged to be part of it, and I'm honored to be talking to the community here today. So just a side note before we continue on, the title of my presentation is VDI, and I might say desktop virtualization as well. But in general, when we're talking about the future of VDI, I'm talking all types. So either traditional VDI with single user VMs, or RDSH, and we're talking both full desktops or just published apps. We're talking both DaaS and cloud-based VDI or on-premises, although as will become clear later on, a lot of the future things will be involving cloud-based VDI. But this is just to say, for the future, we're talking about several different forms of VDI and desktop virtualization. So this presentation, though, it's VDI in the world of workspaces, because we know a lot is changing in the rest of end user computing. As VDI advances, it doesn't happen in a vacuum, so we have to see what's going on. And so why look at the rest of end user computing? And it's a super broad space. And a lot of us, we concentrate on just one area or another because, frankly, that's our jobs. And it's really a lot to bite off and chew to be super deep in all of those areas. So, and it's my job to, I'm a full-time blogger. I don't have users to support. I don't have an environment that I have to maintain. On the other hand, it's my job to keep a view across horizontally across all of these other parts of end user computing. And so doing this helps us avoid the problem that we alluded to in the VDI delusion of that parable of when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So this is why I'm taking this time in my presentation to look over the broad context. So here's a tour of the rest of what's going on in end user computing. I'll actually start with mobility. And of course, it's 2018. Everybody does mobility now. Android has been around for a decade. iOS has been around for even longer. And mobility is part of all of our jobs now. Now, some people might think, well, mobility, like at our company, we don't do MDM, or we don't do enterprise mobility management, or we don't really do mobility because we haven't developed any custom mobile apps, or all of our critical line of business apps are web apps or desktop apps or something. But still, I would argue with that in 2018, every company is a mobile company. By the way, another lesson that I'll learn in this session is not to put so many years in my headlines, because this article, of course, was written in 2018, but it's 2019 now. Fortunately, BrianMadden.com has an SEO expert in-house right now with my colleague Kyle Johnson. And that's one of the first things that he told me was to stop putting years in headlines, even when it's just, unless it's, of course, something that's tied to a specific date. But anyway, mobility matters to all of us now. And to that end, I even think enterprise mobility management is something that all organizations could get the benefits from. I'm talking things like pushing email settings, pushing Wi-Fi settings, or deploying the enterprise apps that you do have and configuring them using the app config capabilities. I believe that this is something that will sure save a lot of help desks a lot of time. So the bottom line is mobility, it's not passé. It's not like, oh, we already went through all this mobile stuff, now it's done. There are many more projects in the pipeline. Just look at all of the places that the point of sale devices, the kiosks, the rugged devices that are going to be moving over to likely to things like Android and iOS over the years. I strongly believe that we're still in the early days. Fortunately, by now, all of this EMM stuff is fairly mature. This chart is my chart of use cases of different EMM techniques versus different use cases like MDM and app management and mobile threat defense and stuff. And really, so this is maybe, if you're spending your day following VDI and working on desktop virtualization, maybe you gave setting up an MDM server a shot a while back. If you haven't looked at EMM in a while, trust me, it's come a super long way. We have Android Enterprise. The management APIs in Android are completely different than the way that they used to be. Apple MDM is pretty good for corporate lockdown devices. I'm still a little bit curious about where they're going to go with their MDM for BYOD strategy, but it's coming along. And even things like mobile app management SDKs and app wrapping, those you'll remember that we spent a lot of time writing a lot about that in the earlier half of this decade at BrianMadden.com, and those have all matured to be part of a mobility strategy. So there's your very quick tour of what's going on in the mobile space. Onto the endpoints, of course, end user computing is the endpoints as well. And in the VDI space, because we're considering, because it's our job to deliver Windows, we know what's going on in Windows 10 with modern management. And we've heard about all the ways that modern management is going to be cool with no more imaging, and we can manage from the cloud, and the devices don't have to be on the VPN to manage them, and there's just automatic enrollment. And sure, it sounds cool. We also know that all of these things are going to be a huge change, and that Windows as a service is something that's going to be quite a challenge to adopt. But that's why it's important to remember that all of this modern management stuff, it's a spectrum, and we don't have to do it all at once. Maybe one part of modern management that you adopt is that you just put an agent on the device, just so that your identity and access management system can be aware of the device, because maybe we're using an IDaaS for some of our SaaS apps, but it's not really hooked into what we're doing to manage our traditional laptops. So maybe that's one aspect of modern management that you could do to get them hooked together. Now, of course, we also know that at many companies, we're more worried about getting off of Windows 7 right now, and we'll worry about modern management in, let's see, what day is today? So today's May 2nd. So we'll worry about modern management in about 8.5 more months. Moving on to just a few more parts of endpoint management. If you're not aware, Mac management, MacBooks and iMacs and all that, this field is growing like crazy. And I remember there was a time 5 or 10 years ago, especially, when lots of people, I remember at BRI Forum conferences 10 years ago, when more and more people were making the switch over to Macs, or just to see what these devices are like. And so now in 2019, what's going on is that Mac management, actually bringing these devices formally under management, is really growing like crazy. Just look at Jamf. They're probably one of the most prominent vendors in this space. In late 2015, they had under 6,000 customers. And then 3.5 years later, earlier this year, they reported they're at 20,000 customers. So there are other vendors, like Fleetsmith is one that just raised a round of funding. Mosul is another one that raised a round of funding. So if you haven't looked at the Mac space in a while, it's really changed quite a bit. No longer is it just like, oh, those pesky Macs. They're going through a process of being formalized into many environments right now. And it's interesting that they're also going through a similar imaging to modern management transition. So if you go check out, like, one resource I like to recommend is the Mac Admins Slack group, or the Mac Admins podcast, are really cool places for getting up to date on what's going on in the Mac space. Chromebooks, to illustrate this point, I'm using this article by Brian Madden, the person appearing, of course, on the VMware Workspace Tech Zone blog. He wrote 4 reasons the Chromebook could be the ultimate enterprise client device. And I agree with all of his reasons. You know, it's secure. We have lots of SaaS and web apps these days, so users can get a lot of work done on it. However, the third-party management options are still somewhat limited, and we're just not seeing this being formalized in the enterprise in quite the way that Macs are these days. But there's a lot that's going on. So the final couple of parts of what's going on in the workspace, and I believe the parts of the workspace that are going to affect the VDI world the most, are what's going on with SaaS apps and identity and workspaces themselves. So in SaaS apps, of course, we know that by now cloud and SaaS apps are real. I mean, look at how we went from talking about, like, how Dropbox could be insecure and we need an enterprise version of Dropbox. And then just like 2 or 3 years later, suddenly everybody has OneDrive, everybody has Box. It's just like a normal standard thing. And now the adoption of Office 365 is well on its way. This is one thing. If you stop and think back to, like, what this was, even what SaaS apps were like back when we wrote the VDI delusion, there have been a ton of changes. One stat that I like, and this comes from Okta, the identity provider, is SAML, one of the main APIs, or one of the main protocols used for federating SaaS apps. The number of ISVs with SaaS offerings that supported SAML grew 700% from 2013 to 2017. So that means that it really is time for a lot of us to really think about identity. This article we published a few years back, this was submitted by Gunnar Berger, and in it he describes how, hey, he was heads down, with his, especially during his time at Gartner, learning about VDI, while all this multi-factor authentication and single sign-on stuff came out. And this article was sort of a mea culpa of, like, hey, we gotta get on board with all of this identity management stuff. And yes, like identity management as a concept and multi-factor authentication and single sign-on and federation, all of these things have been around forever. But what's different in 2019 is, of course, now it's all available as a service, and you have many more apps that can be plugged into it. And the bottom line, it's not just a security thing. It's not just for the infrastructure of a few apps. Identity management is an end user computing thing today. So now finally on to what is the most contentious issue that we're talking about today, it seems like. Just what is a workspace? So many products in our space use the term workspace. Sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't. So what's going on? And to me, a workspace, it isn't complicated. It's just the term for a good end user computing experience. That's an experience where you've put some thought into how to deliver mobile apps, mobile devices, web apps, SaaS apps, and endpoints. I mean, it's pretty clear we all understand that end user computing is about all of these things. It's about the Windows and the mobile and the web and the identity. So a workspace, it isn't complicated. It's just you've at least considered how all of these elements are going to work together. Yes, there are some products with the term workspace in them. Of course, Citrix Workspace App, VMware Workspace ONE, now Dell Unified Workspace, as they announced this week. And we see sometimes workspace, it refers to a virtual desktop. Sometimes workspace refers to some sort of app launching dashboard. But again, I believe that workspace, it doesn't have to be this crazy concept. It's just how we create a good user experience when we have all of these different parts of end user computing. So of course, the key layer for holding together this workspace is the identity management, because the user's identity, whether it's in an on-premises Active Directory or whether it's also synced up to a cloud-based identity as a service like Okta or VMware Identity Manager or Azure Active Directory or some of the stuff that Citrix is doing. The user's identity, of course, is the one element that they have in common, all the way from a published app or a virtual desktop, all the way up to a mobile app and a SaaS app, no matter where they are. So another cool thing that's happening in this workspace area and in identity, you're probably hearing about this conditional access trend. Other terms you've probably heard are Zero Trust, Beyond Corp, contextual access. Gartner likes CARTA, and of course, conditional access is the term that Microsoft is using. All of these terms, they all mean the same thing. This is the idea that you're basing user access to applications based on how much you trust the device or what type of device is, whether it's managed or unmanaged. The sensitivity of the data. Are we talking the application that tells you what's on the menu in the cafeteria, or are we talking the spreadsheets that you're using to work on the numbers for next quarter? Also, on the context of the user, is the user logging in at the normal time of day that they usually do, or are they logging in from the other side of the world, where they're on vacation and they're logging in from a computer that's in an internet cafe or something? So conditional access is the idea that we take all of these things into account before we give users access. Now, all of this stuff is, I promise, all of this stuff is going to come back and be related to the future of VDI. One or two last trends I want to point out along the same lines. Authentication is getting much better these days. I mean, we have adaptive and step-up authentication and multi-factor authentication. I'm sure we've all heard plenty of times how terrible passwords are and how far multi-factor authentication can go towards avoiding so many breaches. And we have things like, to help that, we have standards like WebAuthn, and FIDO2 is something got ratified, and these FIDO hardware keys they're considered to be much more phishing resistant. So there's a lot going on there, and to be optimistic about. Another thing that I'll mention is that all of these cloud-based identity management services, they can work for your on-premises apps too. Of course, most of us, the journey that we're going on is, okay, our on-prem apps, the identity is handled through Active Directory, and then you sync that up to your IDaaS, and your cloud-based IDaaS controls access to all of your SaaS apps and all of your apps that are not in your data center. But this can come full circle, and these cloud-based identity management systems can control access to your on-prem apps as well, usually by some sort of proxy. So that means that your on-prem VDI environment the access can be controlled through a cloud-based IDaaS. So really the only concern in this identity management world, the biggest concern is like any departmental apps that maybe the department, they went out and put this on their own credit card, and it's not even visible to IT, and they're just using passwords and not really enforcing any policies. Those are a big risk. But once you get plugged into the IDaaS, then there's a lot to be excited about. So now we've established the context of what a workspace is and what's going on in that world. So what does all this workspaces stuff mean for VDI? And on the surface, yeah, it seems like some VDI use cases may be diminishing, right? I mean, if we have more mobile apps and more web apps, sometimes, like when in the early days of the iPads, I remember people would publish Office so that they could get Office on their iPad, so that they could do a PowerPoint presentation from their iPad. But of course, now Microsoft has, for years now, we've had native Office apps for the iPad. Or think about management use cases. Sometimes we do VDI to manage the complexity of Windows. Well, ostensibly, modern management, if Windows management gets easier thanks to modern management, then that could, in theory, diminish the use cases for if we're using VDI as a Windows management technique. But then again, how often are just one of these few elements the sole reason why we're doing VDI? The real world use cases are, of course, much more complex. And let's just reveal these use cases real quick. Of course, one of the existing use cases is any use case that you've found already. So existing VDI deployments. If you had a good reason to do VDI in the past, it's probably still valid today. And we can all assume, and I think we all believe, that business critical Windows apps, they don't just go away instantly, and they're going to be around for a long time. So anything that you've done already is still a strong use case. And there are a lot of reasons why we do VDI. Maybe it's we don't want any data on the endpoint for security reasons, or to use it as a remote access thing, or we need to deliver Windows apps to non-Windows devices, or we have apps that work way better in the data center. Maybe they're resource intensive, or they need to be close to the data, or they're difficult to manage. Or as I mentioned, there's the traditional reason of dealing with the complexity of Windows. Because of course, modern management right now has many limitations. So this traditional use case is one that's going to be with us for a while. Now, speaking of all these traditional reasons for doing VDI, I want to point out something that I learned from TechTarget research recently. So a few weeks ago on the blog, I asked, is this the year of VDI? We're at a high point according to TechTarget research. And so TechTarget, that's of course the parent company that owns BrianMadden.com. Every year they do this giant 5,000 person survey that goes across all aspects of IT. And on that survey, we ask them, what are your end user computing plans for the year? And so they can pick from a check boxes. And one of the options is VDI and desktop virtualization. And you see in the first two bubbles in 2017 and 2018, and indeed for several years prior to 2017, that's hovered around the 20% mark. But in 2019, the number of VDI plans went up to 31%. This is a high watermark. Now, of course, we know that not all those projects are going to make it into completion, and some of them are going to be kicked over into the following year. But regardless, looking at our year-over-year data, this is a high point for VDI and desktop virtualization plans. So again, with the future use cases, let's go back to our assumption. We're assuming that as we go in the future, VDI is cheaper and easier. Some of this may be in the immediate future, some of this may be in the distant future. But imagine that cloud-based VDI is as easy to use as any other SaaS app. Again, some of this could be quite a ways in the future, but it's the underlying concept. So this means that we're assuming that VDI, it's only pay for what you use, it's deploy in a few clicks. Again, just as easy as we would go use Gmail or Dropbox today. So that opens up some interesting new use cases. One of the new use cases that's most compelling to me is part-time use cases. So think of enabling Macs, Chromebooks, or iPads, or other non-Windows devices. In the past, like imagine you had a population of users, they're like, hey, those MacBooks look really cool, and I want to work on a MacBook, but on the other hand, I need a couple of Windows apps, to close the books at the end of the quarter for like the last week of the quarter, day of the quarter. I need this one Windows app. And again, like assuming a greenfield scenario, like there's no way that you're going to go to all the trouble and expense of buying hardware and setting up an on-premises VDI environment just so that someone can like use their Mac or like get really into iPad usage. It's just not cost effective. You're going to say, sure, like, yeah, just stick with the Windows laptops. Trust us, we can avoid that whole VDI complexity. But if in the future VDI is really that simple, and it truly is, we just pay for what we use, then sure, it could be give it a shot, and so that user they could do their BYO MacBook, or we could enable an employee choice program, choose a MacBook or choose whatever device you want. And then suddenly that use case of, oh, well, this user needs a Windows app for like an hour a month, or just some random use case that comes up, then it's, in theory, again, I'm talking the far out future, it's just a few clicks and a few dollars worth of time on the cloud VDI platform, and there you go. And this even helps support Windows Modern Management. And this is interesting because as I was preparing for this, it's interesting that looking at the future of VDI, the past comes up so much. So in 2013, we realized, hey, Windows 8.1, that was the first version of Windows that had mobile device management as we knew it. But of course, MDM for Windows 8.1 could barely touch the traditional Windows apps. So I wrote in that article, to make MDM alone work for Windows, we have to truly abstract all of our remaining traditional Windows apps, either via remote desktops or Type 2 client hypervisors. Again, this was 2013. Or we need to be able to replace them all with Windows Store apps or web apps. So we know that some of these things, like the Windows Store apps, are probably less likely. But my point here is, look at the way that Microsoft has thought with Windows 10 in S mode. We're thinking a device that becomes so stateless, and sure, it's Windows, but from our perspective, it's might as well be a MacBook or an iPad or something, in that we don't want to be putting fully installed traditional applications down on there. This is another use case where easier and cheaper VDI could really play a role in enabling those. Now, there are several other use cases that come to mind. Of course, virtual workstations. It's always the CapEx versus OpEx argument. The CapEx of buying a $5,000 or $10,000 high-end graphics CAD workstation versus the OpEx of renting it in the cloud. And of course, the virtual workstation use case has also helped out thanks to all of the progress that GPU virtualization and the GPU-enabled cloud instances have made. as well as disaster recovery use cases. Of course, DRing your on-prem VDI up to a cloud VDI instance, or even in certain scenarios, using this as DR for your physical devices. And finally, another part-time use case, seasonal bursting per project. One example that I hear is visual effects studios, that they get a contract, they're going to work on the next Avengers movie, or maybe they get a contract to lighten up all those dark scenes in Game of Thrones or something. So they need to bring on a bunch of people all at once, and they need to have all these high-end workstations for like a month. Well, that's like a perfect per project use case for cloud VDI. The one last use case that I'll mention is SaaS apps and SaaS security. Now, of course, this idea of remote browsing has been around. A lot of times we think of remote browsing as a way to, when we're on a trusted endpoint, to keep all the dangerous parts of the internet off of our endpoint. But this is the idea here that, sure, the underlying tech may be different. Some of these remote browsing platforms, they use something that's more like Chromium running in a container on top of Linux. But a lot of the ideas are the same. It's remoting pixels. In this case, what it enables you to do for SaaS apps is to wrap a bubble of DLP around your applications. So maybe you want to watermark an application, a web app or a SaaS app that a contractor is going to use, or someone's doing BYO access and you don't want anything left behind by that web app. This is a use case that I guess as a mobility person that has thought a lot about BYOD, this one has always felt compelling to me, and I think it's one that will continue into the future. And by the way, this is another example of articles where I should really say in the future rather than 2018, because it's 2019 now. So Kyle, my SEO champ, if you're listening, I've got the lesson. So of course, we're talking VDI in the world of workspaces. And now that we've talked about all these emerging use cases in the future of VDI, and we've talked about the future of workspaces, let's one last time bring the two together and see how VDI can be a good citizen of the workspace. So our goals, of course, we've become familiar with the end user competing context so we can avoid that hammer and nail problem. And we've talked about how VDI will become as service-like as possible. So to make VDI a citizen of the workspace, of course, first there's some identity management tasks. It's thinking like, hey, can we use that cloud-based identity management platform as the identity layer for our VDI desktops? Or can we enable true single sign-on? So whatever client the user is coming to the virtual desktop from, so that they can just do a true one click without having to re-enter a password, and that the authentication of the session is federated over. And also that goes for the desktops, or the applications within the desktops. So we want to figure out how to make all of this identity management plumbing work. Another task is, of course, figuring out where and how to expose our remote and app desktops within the workspace. Of course, that may mean if the user is accessing their workspace through some sort of dashboard or portal, it's surfacing the apps there, it's having shortcuts or launchers, and even this other idea of file type association for remote desktop apps. I'm thinking, out in the future, this is something that you don't really see much today. But imagine you're on your iPad and there's a file type that you really need to open in a Windows app. Nothing on an iPad can handle it. But like you're in the Box client or some sort of file sync and share client. Imagine in the future if there's a way to do a file type association from that native mobile file sync and share app into your VDI environment. Now, again, this is something that's more futuristic, but this is an example of how in the future of workspaces, VDI becomes a key part of that. And of course, also it's good to be aware of what's going on in this conditional access or that zero trust or contextual access beyond corp stuff that I was talking about. So this is like understanding what risk buckets our identity management system has, and figuring out, okay, how do we let our identity management system, which may have all the context about the user's device and where the users come from, how do we let the IDaaS make that decision? Or another interesting idea that comes up, and we've seen this demoed by the desktop virtualization vendors before. We know that this is a thing that is happening or can happen, is a remote app as an alternate client. Say the user is coming into their web-based workspace portal or whatever, and they're on a corporate device. Well, they can open up a file or open up a web app locally on that machine. But from a BYOD device, they go into that web-based portal or that app-based portal, and they go in and they get the remote app instead. So these are all ways that VDI can become a good citizen of the workspace. You know, I think both the future of VDI and the future of workspaces, I get to look across all of that, and the future of both are very exciting. And I'm really looking forward to all the ways that, of course, VDI is going to keep improving, and that it is going to be a part of the workspace as the workspace continues to develop. So thanks very much. That's the end of my prepared session, and I have about 3.5 minutes left for questions, I think. And so I see Blair popping up in the session as well. So any questions to do so far?
We don't have any questions that popped up, Jack, but we do have some raffle winners.
Yeah, that's pretty exciting.
So I'll just ask people to stick around. But Jack, I really want to thank you. That was a great session, and I fully agree. The future of VDI is really exciting. It's been the year of VDI for a long time, or maybe it's not been the year of VDI for a long time. That's the exciting nature of it all. I just, along with you, and also on behalf of all of my peers at Login VSI, thanks to you, Jack, and all of our presenters and our attendees today. Can't thank you guys enough for making this such a success for us. This has been absolutely remarkable. So, I think we have just a few more minutes for the entire summit. And what I'd like to do is just announce, Jack, if you let me steal control of the share, I'd like to announce our winners for the raffles today, if I could.
Yeah, absolutely, take control. And so I'll take this as my last opportunity to say thank you very much for having me. I'm honored to be able to do the closing keynote. This was a super fun topic, and for everybody that was listening, I'm sure we'll all see a lot of each other at conferences coming up. So looking forward to that, and thank you very much.
Right on, right on. Well, yeah, I look forward to playing music with you sometime too, man. Okay, so let's get started with our raffle. We have a few raffle winners that we can announce right now. We also have a few that will be announced over email. So without further ado, number one from our sponsors, Tin Tree by DDN, Amazon gift card, and the winner of that Amazon gift card, Jose Molina. So thank you very much for being a part of that raffle. We will absolutely be in touch with you. Yes, more fanfare, please. And thank you. So we'll move on to the next winner, the winner of Cisco's Bluetooth earbuds. Drum roll, please. Chris Rossetti. I love this. I wish we could do this more often. Cool. Chris, we'll be in touch with you as well. Congratulations on winning that. We have one more raffle prize to announce. That's from our friends at Flexible IT. I have one of these speakers, and I love it. I use it all the time. I take it everywhere I go. The Bose SoundLink speaker. Scott Strain. Yeah! Flexible IT. Scott, we'll be in touch with you too. Congratulations on that. There are a few more items that were up for raffle from our friends at Datrium, iGel, and Pivot 3. Yeah, Datrium with those with the AirPods. I know I'd like to have a pair of those. Too bad I didn't submit my name. So you, whoever raffled out on that one, they'll be in touch with you. IGEL, it's not just a skateboard. Hopefully you guys signed up for the survey and took the survey. Jed and his crew over there will be happy to get in touch with you if you're a winner of that Porsche. I wish I could be a winner of that Porsche. And lastly, Pivot 3 with the hovercraft with the X-Wing fighter from Star Wars. That's also really, really cool. So they will be in touch with you if you won. Again, I want to congratulate the entire Login VSI crew on a job well done today. You know, it's a pleasure to be working with you, and I want to thank all of our attendees today and all of our presenters. Couldn't have done it without you. Let's look forward to next year doing the same thing, and we'll see you at Synergy. See you, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you for joining. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you.